Paris, the 1730s. A massacre unfolds. The blood spilled in this cobblestone courtyard doesn't belong to the citizens of the crown, yet the slaughter is absolute. It's a carefully staged trial and execution, complete with an improvised gallows. But the victims, dangling from the nooses, swaying in the cold air, they are entirely feline.
The Great Cat Massacre of Rue Saint-Séverin presents a dark, complex theater. To a modern observer, slaughtering alleyways full of cats looks like a sudden descent into primitive cruelty. The reality is far more calculated. This event marks a total mechanical failure in the urban logic of an entire city. It's a symptom of a dying economic system, signaling the collapse of an industry from the inside out.
The origin of this violence stems from an exact inversion of the social order, located deep within the printing workshop of Jacques Vincent. The air in there was thick with the smell of ink and the ceaseless sound of heavy labor. At the absolute bottom of this hierarchy were two apprentices, Jerome and Levé. They slept in a freezing, filthy upper room and were fed rancid leftovers, meals they bitterly described as cat food. In stark contrast, the master's wife absolutely adored her felines, particularly a favored gray cat known as La Grise. This pampered creature consumed roasted poultry and slept by the fire. The feline had been elevated far above the human. The absurdity of a cat dining on roasted poultry while an apprentice starved on rancid scraps wasn't some ancient tradition. It was the endpoint of the French printing guild's decay. Back in the 17th century, the printing workshop functioned as a shared republic of labor. Masters and journeymen worked side by side. They shared a common identity. By 1730, that republic had mutated into an oligarchy of privilege. Masterships became hereditary privileges passed exclusively from father to son or husband to widow. The shared labor vanished entirely. Eventually, this led to desperate extraterritorial repression by the 1780s.
The machinery of this oppression was tightly choked by the crown itself. The absolute limit of authorized printers in the sprawling metropolis of Paris was restricted to exactly 36. Just 36 legitimate positions for an entire city. For the journeymen and apprentices, the door to advancement was permanently locked shut. They were reduced to a permanent class of hired hands with no conceivable path forward.
Those trapped within this static hierarchy were transformed into liminal creatures. They became invisible laborers, locked in a perpetual transition between childhood and adulthood within an economic system that had simply stopped moving. The master, meanwhile, had withdrawn entirely from the physical craft. He was no longer a fellow laborer. He was a bourgeois who slept late in a warm bed, while these liminal creatures opened the freezing workshop at 4 in the morning. This highly specific environment forged a structural trap. A structural trap is an economic system that ceases to recognize human advancement, rendering the ruling masters entirely untouchable. When human beings are cornered in a structural trap, they stop attacking the system directly. They stop attempting to strike the unassailable figures of authority. Instead, they hunt for proxies. They seek out and destroy the very symbols of the master's status. Levé, one of those exhausted apprentices, was also a perfect actor. He devised a cunning strategy to secure a proxy kill order. Night after night, he climbed onto the freezing roof directly above the master's bedroom and began to caterwaul. He mimicked demonic shrieks and wailed into the darkness. The master, obtuse and deeply superstitious, became thoroughly convinced he was being haunted by witches. Terrified, he gave the apprentices an official commission to exterminate the cats. Without realizing it, the master had inadvertently signed the death warrant for his own status symbols. The apprentices didn't merely kill strays, they executed a blueprint of resentment. They hunted specifically for the favorite, La Grise. The brutal smashing of this favored cat's spine with a heavy iron bar before stuffing its broken body into a gutter wasn't just a random act of blind rage. It was the precise physical execution of this deeply seated blueprint of resentment. It was violence with a highly specific architecture. The slaughter rapidly evolved from a mere extermination into a highly organized event. The entire workshop, journeymen and apprentices together, gathered sacks of half-dead cats and dragged them into the courtyard. Here, they established a mock trial, creating a severe pattern interrupt of typical 18th century labor disputes. They didn't strike for wages, they erected improvised gallows. They assigned strict roles. There were armed guards, a presiding judge, a confessor, and an executioner. They solemnly found the animals guilty and hanged them from the wooden beams.
This complex theatrical display is defined as ritual punning. It's a theatrical and symbolic act of rebellion used by 18th century workers to communicate severe grievances through mockery rather than direct physical strikes against their employers. By utilizing ritual punning, the workers transformed the printing workshop into a theater of humiliation. When the master arrived, he was entirely oblivious, obsessed only with the lost labor time caused by the distraction. But his wife understood instantly. She suffered the true psychological blow, realizing the grim theater was direct targeted attack on her.
The target of this ritual punning was chosen with exact precision. In the logic of the 18th century mind, cats were multivocal entities. They weren't merely household pets. As multivocal symbols, they carried multiple simultaneous meanings. They were intrinsically linked to witchcraft and the occult, bearing a dark superstitious dread, while simultaneously serving as highly vulgar associations for human anatomy.
Because of these deeply entrenched multivocal meanings, the execution carried devastating gravity. In the street slang of the era, the word la chatte carried the exact same double meaning then as its equivalent does today. Therefore, isolating, torturing, and killing the mistress's favorite cat was effectively a metonymic rape. It was a symbolic equivalent of murder and a profound permanent assault on the master's reputation, achieved by destroying a proxy intimately linked to the target.
The chaotic, deafening noise of the courtyard execution, the banging of heavy iron tools and the mock bleating of goats constituted a Charivari. A Charivari is a form of rough music and public noise weaponized to humiliate those who severely violated community norms. This dissonant cacophony was designed to forcibly restore balance. It violently deafened the ears of a master who had long ignored the quiet suffering of his starving workers.
The conflict starkly pitted the untamed nature of the wild street against domesticated privilege. The grueling laborers of the press were known strictly by animalistic nicknames. The heavy pressmen were called bears, and the nimble compositors were monkeys. These raw, untamed forces of the working street were colliding violently with the pampered, domesticated privilege of the bourgeois house cats. It was pure, unadulterated class warfare operating under the thin disguise of animal control. The ultimate driving motivation behind the slaughter was a desperate primal need to reclaim commensality. Commensality is the fundamental social act of eating together at the same table, sharing in the bounty of labor. The workshop had entirely lost this. The massacre was a violent attempt to reverse the severe indignity of men eating rancid scraps in the gutter while animals dined on roasted poultry at the master's table. Through the execution, they sought to violently restore commensality. The cultural impact of this theatrical violence possessed a profound permanence. Lavelli and his fellow workers didn't allow the memory of the courtyard to fade. Over the succeeding weeks, they reenacted this mock trial at least 20 times. With every single reenactment, beating their tools and mimicking the agony of the execution, they cemented a hardened class solidarity against the master's isolated, oblivious authority.
The dark laughter and rough music echoing from the Rue Saint-Séverin printing shop reveals the rapid formation of the revolutionary temper. Decades before the actual fall of the French monarchy, this collective consciousness and street-level history was already solidifying into a weapon. The data shows the guild system was functionally dead. The system attempted to centralize control through desperate extraterritorial repression, but the street-level history was already slipping from its grasp. The revolutionary temper was awake.
The Great Cat Massacre demonstrates a chilling historical absolute. It proves that when you stop being able to argue with the system, you start to joke. And in the oppressive confines of 18th century Paris, the joke had a noose. The grim laughter that echoed from the absurdity of a dangling cat would endure, eventually finding its way to the cobblestones of the Place de la Revolution 50 years later.
The urban logic of the 18th century collapsed under the immense weight of an unmoving hierarchy, forcing invisible men to hunt the symbols of their oppressors. It leaves a haunting, unresolved parallel for the modern era. When a modern economic system feels like a structural trap, what are the proxies we target in our digital courtyards today? The fundamental mechanics of resentment remain identical. It's left to us to identify the symbols of privilege currently hanging in the gallows of our own time.